as we're getting ready for Passover, what I wanted to do is, a lot of us, like when we think about Passover, we go straight to our Seders and how the Seder, is such a fundamental part of Passover. And that's really just the first night. And we have all 7 days, right, of Passover, um, and the different rituals. But what we do today is a much more modern phenomenon than how Passover has always been celebrated. And so, what I want to do is to actually take us back to the roots of the first night of Passover and start to look about how it got developed and the different things that helped to develop it into the Seder that we know today. So, therefore, when in a week and a half that you sit down to go and celebrate Passover and you sit down at a Seder and you're looking at your Haggadah, that you'll start to see kind of where did these things come from? Like they didn't exactly happen this way all the time. But you're able to kind of see the evolution of it. And so I want to kind of take you through that. At any point, please stop and ask questions and kind of look at this. One of the things that you should know is that I wrote my thesis in rabbinical school about the Seder and the Haggadah and all of that. So I get really excited about these things, but I haven't actually taught it in such a long time. So I'm really excited about that. So let's start. Before the Israelites ever actually left Egypt, we already had our first encounter with what we now know of as a Passover Seder. And it happens the night, as we know, that the Israelites know that the last plague is about to come. They all are coming to each other's houses in order to be able to get together, because they need to get together in order to escape quickly. And they're told about a meal that they are to have. And this meal helps us to kind of figure out the key parts to how our Seder goes. So we have this in Exodus chapter 12, starting with verse 3. Do I have anyone who would like to read from our sheets? And if you don't have our sheet, just let me know and I can pass it on. Anyone want to give us our first encounter? Katie, thanks.
Okay, now I just need to have it on the same screen. Okay, the first Seder? Okay,
yeah.
The first Passover celebration occurred the night immediately before the Exodus. God instructs Moses and Aaron in Exodus 12:3-8. Speak to the whole community of Israel and say that on the 10th of this month, each of them shall take a lamb to a family, a lamb to a household. But if the household is too small for a lamb, let him share one with a neighbor who dwells nearby, in proportion to the number of persons. You shall contribute for the lamb according to what each household will eat. You shall keep watch over it until the 14th day of this month, and all the assembled congregation of the Israelites shall slaughter it at twilight. They shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they are to eat it. They shall eat the flesh that same night. They shall eat it roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and with bitter herbs.
Okay, so what do we notice from this first meal that, well, it's not their first meal, but this meal that they have before they leave Egypt? What are some of the key things that we notice about it?
Prescriptive sharing.
Okay, prescriptive sharing. Yes, this is how you are to do it, and this is what you are to eat. Yes, absolutely. What else do we notice from it? We notice that there's certain food that they are to eat, right? Of the prescriptive things, right? So we have the lamb, and that it's going to be the sacrifice that is offered of it, but it's that you are to then also eat part of it. And you don't want to leave any to waste, that you invite people over, right? So this isn't something that you just do on your own, but you invite people around your table. The more the merrier. Everyone's kind of coming together. So it's a community type thing, but it's done in a home. It's not done somewhere else. It's not, where everyone's going away, but you're doing it within your home. And that when you're having the lamb, there's certain things that you eat with it. You have unleavened bread and you have bitter herbs. So this what?
I wanted to ask about that because I thought the unleavened bread was what they took with them on their backs because they didn't have time for it to rise. But this suggests that they were intentionally eating unleavened bread without the knowledge of that they were leaving the next day or knowledge that they were leaving at all at that time. Am
Well, so
I
they
understanding that
Yeah,
correctly?
you are understanding that correctly. So they did know that they were going. Like they were this instructions, right? Like they know that they're about to go, and that's why they're getting together. They're having this meal. It's festive. It's all of that. But what's interesting is that the unleavened bread, the story that we tell most often, is about this like, oh, we have to like get quickly away, and so they didn't have any times, which we do hear about in the story. But what we don't already know is that unleavened bread was actually just a cracker that they ate all the time. That was like part of like their food, that when you got together, just like we have cheese and crackers a lot of times, they would have, and they would eat the bitter herbs with the lamb, right? You need to have like a sauce with it. You need to have something tasty with it. And so this was like their meal that they had with it. And so that was already part of the custom. But what we're going to learn is that food and Passover gets very specific and how we kind of tell the story. And so this, like, we now know that this is kind of the first of it, that there's a meal that has the lamb, you come together with people in your house, you have unleavened bread, and you have bitter herbs. Sounds pretty familiar to what we know of today. That's all they did. There wasn't any, well, the Exodus hasn't happened at this point, so there's no telling the story. They do this. And so we then also find out, even before the Israelites leave Egypt, that they must observe this instruction for all time, for all of your descendants, that they're going to be finding out that this moment that they're in is an important moment in Jewish history, and that they need to observe it, and that they need to come back to it and to do that. And so later on, when the rabbis go and look and say, hey, okay, we're supposed to observe this instruction for all times, but what is the instruction that we're supposed to observe? They have to then try to figure out, what are we supposed to do? And that's where we start to see that the one thing that we know is that there was this meal, right? And so we need to take this meal and observe this, along with some of the other rules that we find out later on about the 7 days and eating unleavened bread and all of that, and taking time off for work, that we're going to recreate this moment. And so that is how this tradition gets started, that we have a Seder. Unlike all the rest of our holidays, right? Most of our holidays, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, we come to the synagogue, we do things here. Other places. This one we specifically, I mean, you can come to our synagogue. Our synagogue is our home for a Seder, but traditionally it was done in people's homes. And now they're taking that and saying, okay, later on, what are we going to do? So for most of the time, up until the destruction of the Second Temple, Passover was celebrated as that you would bring a sacrificial lamb, right? You would bring a sacrifice in order to celebrate Passover. But what happened is that when the Second Temple was destroyed, there was no place to be, like, we were starting to kind of change our ways. The rabbis looked at this and said, okay, well, we're no longer doing sacrifices. The same way, we don't have that central temple that we're going to. We're not making the pilgrimage to Jerusalem anymore. We're all living in different places. We're starting to move into the diaspora. We're doing other things. We're coming up with new rituals. And so they start taking the sacrifices and say, okay, we need to come up with something new, and doing it. And so we see that in the Mishnah is a place in which they start to kind of think about, all right, how do we change this? What is going to be our new way of celebrating Passover and remembering this instruction when we no longer have the sacrifice? And so we start to get to what is the first time that we see a Seder that is happening, and that the Mishnah outlines what's going to happen. But they do it in such a way that they're taking in from lots of different things that are going on at that time. So do I have someone that would like to read this part about the Mishnah Seder? So we're now looking at around 200 CE, 200 to 400 CE, that some of this starts to kind of come together. So we can imagine what's going on. Deborah.
The Seder, the ritualized meal, and the Haggadah, the liturgical text, are intertwined, but distinct from one another. Lawrence Hoffman explains that the Seder developed before the Haggadah, and its origin resembled the Greco-Roman meal known as a symposium. The standard format for a symposium included an intellectual discourse following a meal in which the food prompted the conversation. The topic of discussion for rabbis was the Exodus narrative. The original structure of the Seder included no liturgy except for the blessing over the food and benedictions for sacred time, such as Kiddush. Hoffman describes the Seder as sacred theater. The introductory prayers set the stage itself being the table and the special foods on which the company dined. The drama opened with a rhetorical question or questions about the food, designed to stimulate a free-flowing account of the Exodus response. The evening ended with praise of God in the form of psalms, known collectively as Hallel. The whole evening was thus structured to move from one food to two questions to three response and four celebrative praise. Do you want me to keep going?
No, let's just stop kind of right there. So here we have it, is that they're starting to develop this new way of kind of observing Passover. They're taking from what's already been told in the Torah. And then they're also living at a time of the Greco-Roman period where a symposium was a very big deal. And so they're like, okay, how do we bring this in? Maybe this is actually a way, like we're supposed to be doing this around a table, right? Like if we look back into the Torah, we see that we came around the table with a lamb and with bitter herbs and matzah, unleavened bread. We have that there. And now what if we design it in such a way like a symposium where people come around and we allow the food, right, that they did at a Greco-Roman table in order to, the food at that table in order to use that as our way to ask questions, that we would put it out. So now all of a sudden, this kind of goes back to where you were, Gail, earlier asking, well, wait a second, isn't this like the matzah all supposed to be about the fact that we didn't have time? Well, they brought out the matzah, which was originally on the table, but now they start to bring meaning to it. And same with the bitter herbs, where the bitter herbs were just something that we used before. Now the bitter herbs start to represent something, represent the slavery that happened. The matzah starts to represent the matzah starts to represent the escape and that we didn't have time out of that. And so they start to create different foods where we'll later on get charoset, where we'll get the dipping the parsley and the salt water. All of them are ways in which it starts to kind of help us start a conversation, because like the Greco-Roman symposium, you started with food and then you start to ask questions. And then the questions start to allow for answers. There's not answers given, but people start a conversation that allows for this to kind of go on. And so we start to see that the Seder comes way before the Haggadah is ever created. It's just a forum for people to come together to remember what happened in the Exodus, and on that day in such a way that is very common during those times. You even see it where we're told that we're supposed to lean as we do the Seder. That was also a custom of the Greco-Roman time, that we do it as like, well, if we're free, then we should be able to lean and take it easy or whatever. And that was the same thing that the Greco-Romans did. So we're taking from that period of time and bringing it all in. Questions? Thoughts, commentary. So with this, the rabbis at the time of the Mishnah, start to try to figure out, okay, so what are the questions that we're going to ask? What is the Passover meal? Where do we get that? What's kind of happening? And so we find out that there's like three things that must happen in it. The Pesach, that gets the meaning of the passing over of the houses, and that we get the matzah of our ancestors being redeemed from Egypt, and the maror is the embittered lives of our ancestors in Egypt. So we get those three things that they say that we need to do, and we find that in the Haggadah now. You'll see that when you go through it this year, that it's on there. But what I want you to do is to go to the next page. And I'm going to take you through chapter 10 of the Mishnah Pesachim to give you an idea of how they started to structure this. So in this Mishnah tractate, it's all about Passover, and it's all about the different laws or whatever, chapters 1 through 9. But when you get to chapter 10, it's specifically about kind of this meal that we have, what we now know of as the Seder. And what I've kind of done in this chart is to kind of show about how they really go about taking from these different kind of periods of time to bring it all into one, so that we have biblical practices that they're trying to bring in. What does the Bible, the Torah, tell us that we need to do? What are the Greco-Roman practices that were happening at that time and start to be brought in? And what is really important to early rabbinic Judaism, and how do they do that? And then the final column has now later on, once we get the Haggadah, which really comes once we have a printing press. So that's not until the 14th century. I think it's around the 14th century that we get the printing press, and that's when we get the Haggadah. So, and then as you have seen, there's so many different Haggadahs out there that kind of go off of it. But up until that point, we have something that's very similar to what the Mishnah says, that it's coming together around this table using some of these things. Any questions? Okay, so as we kind of go through, as you will see that there's different verses within the chapter. I'm going to read these because then I can explain through it. So it starts, on Passover Eve, just before the mincha offering, one may not eat until it becomes dark. And even the poorest Israelite may not eat unless he reclines. And they should provide him with no fewer than 4 cups of wine. And even if he is the poorest of the poor who takes from the public charity, he must do whatever it takes to have 4 cups of wine. So in this first part, we already see that when it is that we need to come in order to have it, because we're celebrating on the night in which they were to leave. And we start to see this reclining, right? This reclining shows us about freedom that we have, and everyone was to do it. We also see kind of that someone is going to pour for them. Like, you're not supposed to pour for yourself on Passover. You're supposed to have someone else pour for you, because we're free. Like, we have this luxury of this. And so everyone gets to do this. And wine is also a luxury. And so having that and making sure that everyone in the community can have that no matter what. And so we start with that. Now the details of the Seder now start to happen. And this is now in verse 2. So the details of the Seder: when they have mixed the first cup of wine to recite Kiddush over it, the house of Shammai says, he says a blessing over the day, and afterwards he says a blessing over the wine. The house of Hillel says he says a blessing over the wine, and afterwards he says a blessing over the day. So now we start to get into one. We get the tradition of having the cups of wine. We have the tradition of having the fixed blessings. And we have the tradition of there's 2 different opinions of how we should do this. All the way at the very beginning, we do it in the way of Hillel, as we always do it. But we start to see all of that in there. We then go on into our Seder, and it says, now they're setting up the table, right? This is supposed to be sacred theater. So they're setting up the table. And so now what's the next thing? We already have our wine up there, but now we start to get our different parts of it. So when they bring the vegetables, which was often known as like hors d'oeuvres, were like a dipping food in Greco-Roman times. You had all the hors d'oeuvres out. I know at our Passover Seder, we always do it where we have lots of, I mean, if it's going to be a longer Seder, for sure, have lots of like hors d'oeuvres out for people to eat, especially vegetables and different things. And so they have it here. And it was a custom to dip things. Okay, so now we're not going to do it the Greco-Roman way. We're going to do it our way. And so we bring in our own meal of that. So when they bring the vegetables before him, he dips the lettuce, the chazeret that we have, before he comes to breaking the bread and the main meal, which will be our matzah of that. They brought him matzah, lettuce, charoset, and 2 cooked dishes, one a meat dish to remember the Pesach offering, and the customary egg dish that represents the Hagigah festival sacrifice that was offered alongside the Pesach at the temple, even though the charoset is not a religious obligation. Rabbi Elazar Bar Zadok says it is an obligation as a remembrance of the mortar with which the Israelites worked in Egypt. And in the time of the temple, they would bring before him the carcass of the Pesach offering. So here it is that we start to see these customs come in, some of them directly related to what happened in the thing, and some of them as a way of being able to create discussion around it, of how we kind of tell our story. We move on in it, that now that's our first cup of wine. We move on to our second cup of wine. And our second cup of wine actually represents the whole time. So that's like the first part. And you can kind of see it. You remember how it said that there's 4 parts to it. You have the food, the questions, the answers, the praise. So the first cup of wine, we have the food. The second becomes the questions and starting of the storytelling of it. So we get to number 4 of the Mishnah, and it says, they mixed for him a second cup of wine. And here the child asks his father questions. But if the child does not have the intelligence to do so, the father teaches him to ask by pointing them out. All right, so now we start to get our 4 questions that we know of. Why is this night different from all other nights? For on all other nights, we eat leavened and unleavened bread. This night only unleavened bread. For all other nights, we eat all types of vegetables, but on this night, only bitter herbs. For on all other nights, we eat meat, which is roasted, stewed, or boiled, but on this night, the meat is roasted, as we saw on the first night. And for all other nights, we dip our food once, but on this night, twice. And it says that we're to now answer these questions according to the intelligence of the child that the father instructs him. He begins with degradation and concludes with praise and expounds from, my father was a wandering Aramean, until he completes the entire section. So this now starts to be like, okay, so how do we tell the story, right? It all starts by asking questions. We have the food and the questions that spark intellectual discussion, but we know that sometimes we don't know what those questions are. We don't either we don't ask the questions or we don't know what questions to ask. And so we must give questions and help our children to be able to ask them. We are also taught here that we need to do it based on the intelligence of the child and do it in such a way that every person were to understand it in a way. And we start to try to figure out that we need to tell the story. And what the Mishnah tells us is that we need to start with degradation and conclude with praise. But what does that mean? So does anyone with that? We need to start from degradation and end with praise. So how do we tell the story then?
Oh, that was something I had no idea. I never.
Anyone have any ideas? Like, what is the story that we are to tell if we know that we need to start with degradation and end with praise?
Well, the degradation is our submission as slaves to Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And the praise is the praise to the Lord for redeeming us from that situation. And the celebrations that we undertake after we've crossed the water and we're dancing on the other side. So, I mean, is it more than that?
I don't, that's a great question. So that's one answer, and that's absolutely one of the answers, right? It's easy. It's from slavery to being able to be free and all of that, and that could be it. Any other ideas of what it could be? Yeah, Deborah.
Well, for those of us who haven't been slaves, we can, imagine when are those periods in our lives where it was sort of like a slavery of the spirit, So what are those instances that we could learn something that's similar to the learning of leaving slavery, but that applies to our own time and our own self?
Yeah, absolutely. That we can find our own, what is our own degradation, right? What is our own slavery? What is our own praise? What is our own freedom that we can feel and that we can put that in there? Absolutely. Anything else of what it could be? The rabbis had a hard time with this too. They said actually they got into debates about what it should be. And so we actually now have it recorded in our Haggadah later on that there's a section that you get to that there's a debate between Rav and Shmuel that then gets put into a lot of the more traditional Haggadahs. Your kid versions aren't going to have it, but a lot of the other ones have it. And there's this debate between Rav and Shmuel. I have it at the later on in this like packet, but I'll explain it if you want to go over there. But there's this debate between them, and one of them says, actually it's Shmuel says, no, what it means is exactly kind of what Gail was saying, that it starts in Egypt and being slaves in Egypt and goes until being part of the freedom. And Rav says, actually, I think it's a different thing, that I think that it's actually goes all the way back to Abraham and Abraham going and knocking the idols. And that, why do you think that's the degradation? Why do you think he thinks that you need to go all the way back, not to slavery, but go all the way back to the breaking of the idols and idol worship? What is he trying to tell? What story is he trying to tell in there? He's creating a more spiritual story. He's saying that this is about God, and it's about having the freedom to be able that beforehand, when we had all the other gods and that we didn't have a Judaism and that we didn't have any of that, that was when we were like, really, that was degradation. That was the lowest of the lowest, is that when we didn't actually have our God, our oneness of God. And that when Abraham went and they smashed the idols, it was at that moment of the freedom to be able to go and have God that we need to be able to celebrate too. And so we have both a physical and a spiritual one that they're debating. Is it the physical freedom that we're celebrating, or is it the spiritual freedom that we're celebrating? But what this does in allowing this debate to go in there, and what the Mishnah does, it says, actually, there's lots of stories that we can tell. And this exactly with what Deborah just said, is we bring in our own stories, because the Mishnah also tells us that we're supposed to see ourselves as though we came out of Egypt every year, that we were slaves, like bring in our own stories every year. And so we can be able to then tell a different story of it, that it doesn't have to start here. It gets to start where we need it to start, with what we want of it. And so they start to do that, and says, okay, well, if you don't really know where to begin and expound upon the verses of my father was a wandering Aramean, and then complete the entire section. Okay, so well, what is that referring to? And so they say, all right, well, there was this custom a long time ago where when you brought your first fruits once you get into the land, you were always supposed to go and tell a story. And it went to say thank you for it. And it's a story that starts with my father was a wandering Aramean, which gets us back to kind of this other story before. But my father was a wandering Aramean. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and dwelt there. But there he became a great, strong, and numerous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. We cried out to Adonai, the God of our fathers, and Adonai heard our plea and saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. Adonai freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm and awesome power, and by signs and wonders. God brought us to the place and gave us land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And so that's where we get how we start the story. And from there we expand on, but it never tells us where to stop. It allows us to just keep going, which is how then we start to add in all these other things that go in with bringing in the 10 plagues, with bringing in Dayenu, with bringing in all these other things that we start. And you'll see in the Haggadah that we start with talking about my father was a wandering Aramean, because that is what the Mishnah says, start with here and keep it going. And so we just keep adding things on years after year. And with the Haggadah and the creation of it, we are able to expound upon the story. So now we keep going. And we look a little bit more into how all of this kind of comes into being. And we get to verse 5. And we see Rabbi Gamliel used to say, whoever has not referred to or explained the reason for these three matters on Passover has not fulfilled the obligation of narrating the story. And these three things are Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. As I already mentioned before, Pesach being the omnipresent passed over the house of our ancestors, Matzah, because the ancestors were redeemed in Egypt, and Maror, because the Egyptians embittered the lives of our ancestors. And so we see here what I just explained before, that in every generation, we're supposed to see ourselves as though we actually came out, and that we're supposed to tell it to our children. So once again, we have to talk about these three things. It's said in the Haggadah that we have today, we go and we talk about it some more. And then after all of this, that we are obligated to give thanks, that we need to praise. Once we have told all of these things, we are to give praise and sing Hallel. And you'll notice that on all of our festival holidays, we always do a Hallel during our services, which are psalms that we sing out of praise of God. And they're very festive and fun. And a lot of times we skip those parts at our Seders because they're at the very end. And we're like, okay, we're done. We're tired. We've already eaten. Are we done with this thing? I don't know. Maybe you guys are all much better about it, but in lots of them that I've done, we've like forgotten that. And actually, as we see here, that it's in verse 5 and in verse 6, are all of this, that what they're trying to do, and I'm not going to read all the descriptions here, you can your own, but is that you're supposed to be doing praise, not just praise at the temple, but we're bringing praise home, bringing it to the home, and that we sing it over our tables. And so we get the praise of it. If we go to verse 7 in the Mishnah, we now start to get to the third cup of wine. So already they're spacing this out. And we get to the third cup of wine. And the third cup happens right after the meal. So now they're kind of done with the meal, just like when we're done with the meal. And you do Birkat Hamazon, you say the blessing after. So here we start to see in this rabbinic period that we have blessings that we're doing. We're using the wine some more. And then right afterwards, we get the fourth cup of wine. I always find that so interesting that we go very quickly from the third to the fourth. Not very much. The second cup of wine is very long. So that's like the biggest one that you should have. The third, you should make the shortest or the smallest. There's not so much time between. And you get the fourth, where here you complete the Hallel and all the praises. And so, and you have that. So if we get to number 8 is where we learn of the tradition of the Afikomen, comes from the Mishnah here as well. It says one may not conclude the Passover meal with Afikomen, with sweets and other delicacies eaten as dessert, because one is not to eat anything after the Pesach offering in order for the taste of it to remain with them. If some of the people present fall asleep during the meal, they may continue to eat when they wake up. But if all of them fall asleep, they may not eat again because their attention was diverted from the Pesach. Already we know that this is going to be late into the night. And then they get into like a whole discussion, like, what does it mean to fall asleep? Rabbi Yossi says, if they merely doze, they may eat. If they fell asleep and fell into a deep sleep, they may not eat again. So they're very concerned about it and wanting to make sure that you keep a little bit of the Pesach. The meat, the Pesach offering after midnight, at which point it is no longer allowed to be eaten, since it is no longer night, imparts uncleanness to the hands. That which is made pigul or notar, meat of an offering which has remained after the time allotted for eating, imparts uncleanliness to the hands. If a person has said the blessing for the Pesach offering, he is exempt from reciting the blessings offering which he may eat. This is now going into more specific details of it. So we get to the very end kind of all of these things. So what do we learn from all of this? Of how our tradition evolves and what are the key things that we need to be thinking about when if we were to just use the Mishnah and preparing for Passover. What do we learn are the key things that we need to pay attention to? What's our obligation for Passover? Yeah, Deborah. Oh, you're on mute.
The food, the questions, the answers to the questions, and the praise.
Yeah. Yeah, that when we think about it, I think we spend so much time thinking about our Haggadah, right? And just reading through it. But we're not actually supposed to just do Passover that way. Passover is really supposed to be this time of sitting around the table and talking and allowing things to allow conversations to go. That it's not about getting to a certain place that they think that it's going to go on forever, that you're supposed to get really comfortable, that you're supposed to put things out on the table that gets you to start thinking, whether that's food or other things, to be able to ask questions. That it's and those foods have changed over time to get us asking new questions and doing new things. Yeah, Deborah.
Well, and it seems like this brought me a new kind of understanding of the different types of children that are asking the questions. I mean, this to me makes it sound more like make sure that the children that are sitting at your table, that you speak to them on the level that they can really understand. So if you've got teenagers and you've got toddlers, you have to spend a lot more time because you have to be, make it meaningful to them. And so don't just run through the list of questions, but actually say it in a way that all the different kids at the table, I mean, it makes the kids much more important, I think, than I've kind of seen them in my own mind.
Yeah, they're like the most important probably in this. It's about the next generation. And it's actually, they take the tradition of having the 4 children comes from 4 different ways that questions are asked or ways that you're supposed to describe it from the Torah. You'll see that later on in the thing that I gave you, that you have like the wicked child, the child who does not know how to ask, the simple child, the wise child, right? And it comes from the Torah of ways in which, if your child were to ask, this is what you are to say to them. And it allows us not just for children, but I think also for adults, like who is our audience? Who are the people sitting around them and how are we to engage with them? Right? Like what are the issues that they might care about? What are the things that we can put out that gets people talking and connecting to the story? What is our degradation this year? Where is the story starting from? What does it mean to be in Mitzrayim in our narrow places? What is that narrow place for us this year? Yes, it is like it could be the physical, it could be the spiritual, it can be something in between, but it says like you don't have to do it the exact same way. What you're supposed to do is to allow for a conversation to happen. And if you think about it as more of being like a class, and here are all the props that you're putting out here. And I know that like when I do like a lesson plan or I plan something for camp or I do something, like I have an idea and then I let it roll. And it usually never goes in the exact same way that I want, because that's not as engaging. The engaging part is where you put the things out and you see what questions come up. Where's that conversation going to lead? What's the next question that's going to come up? And so we see a lot of things coming out right now from different organizations, different readings to do. of different things to be able to put out to remember this person or that person or these people or this idea. And that's all supposed to spark conversation, to allow us to engage with it, to get into the deep conversations that we kind of forget that we're actually sitting there. Because yes, we're eating and we're doing all of that, but we might fall asleep because we have been so engaged and so like into the whole thing that we're supposed to do. Any other ideas, questions?
Yeah. From what I understand, and feel free to correct me,
Yeah.
that there isn't any historical narrative that supports that this actually occurred. So if one views it as an apocryphal story rather than an actual recording of history,
Mhm.
then where does that take the conversation as to why it was created and told in the first place?
That's a great question. Of why, like, why is this our story? Is that the
Yeah,
question?
right. If it is in fact apocryphal, and
Yeah,
there
yeah, yeah,
we can
yeah,
certainly
absolutely.
debate that.
Totally. Yeah,
Why
no.
is it so crucial? Obviously it's we got the Torah at Sinai as a result of this, so it was the impetus for that. But I wanted to think about the conversations to have this Passover with the people around the table who may also say, if it's not real, then what is it? And how do we frame it for ourselves?
Well, I think I think one of the things I think about is that there's a difference between history and heritage. And I think there is something in this that it is part of it's more of a heritage of ours. History is true facts, and heritage is what gives us like our identity. And I would say that this is a story that gives us our identity. It is said like multiple times, like even when we sing Kiddush on Friday night, we were reminded that we were slaves in Egypt, like we came out of
Yeah.
Egypt. When we, like every single time we go to services and we sing Michamocha, we're reminded that we came out of Egypt. It is said like over and over in the Torah, I think 36 times, that because like we were slaves in Egypt, that we should like help the widow, the oppressed, the poor, that we should, care for the world around us. Like it is our story that makes us who we are. And so it's not historically factual at all. There are parts of it that perhaps we could say that they are, but it's our heritage. It's what makes us who we are. And I think that's, I think every religion, and every group, right, has your stories that you tell, right? Your sacred stories. And this is ours. Like this is our story. Like it becomes part of everything that we do. It becomes like why we care so much about Tikkun Olam. Why do we do so much about social justice in our, synagogues? And as Jews is because we want to reach out. Like we are so lucky to be able to come out of Egypt, out of our narrow places, and to be able to reach a better place. We want others to be able to do that. We use it a lot like within our own personal feelings, right? The spiritual, right? Like that when we can have hard times and we get to better times. That's part of our Jewish story, right? Like, and it's a story that we tell right now too, right? Like we're living in a very hard time to be Jewish right now. And there's a lot that's holding us down, and we feel very like in a narrow place, and all of us in different ways with how we're responding to what is going on in the world. But we also know that Jewish history has its ups and downs of that, and that we can get to a better place. We might go back to an Egypt in a harder place, but we have those ways of being able to come out. And so the story gives us hope. The story gives us direction. The story gives us purpose and meaning. And so that's why we come back to tell it every time, and why we might need to tell it differently. And so what I love about Haggadahs is that it gives us direction and says this is how we do it, and gives us a way of doing it. What I love about going to the Mishnah, what I love about going to the Mishnah is that it gives us the openness and the possibilities of saying, actually, we can do it in different ways. Get the food out on the table and allow the conversation to happen.
Yes, thank you. That's good.
Yeah. Other thoughts? Well, what I would suggest is that as you start to get ready for Passover this year, and when you have your Haggadah, if you take this, I find it so interesting to kind of look at the Mishnah, and if you have your Haggadah, whichever Haggadah that you are using. I know the one, like if you're coming to our community Seder here, we now just do it as a big PowerPoint Haggadah. So it doesn't, but all the parts of it are the same of that. And to be able to kind of see the different layers of it and how it evolves. I think it's such a beautiful thing with our tradition that we're constantly taking and adapting, and where the story is the same, the message is the same, but how we tell it and how we commemorate it and how we look at it changes and evolves over time, from the time of the sacrifice in the temple to the time of the Mishnah that says, okay, let's just sit around here, to the time of the printing press that says, okay, now we can record it, to our times now that we don't even need a printing press, we can just create our own Haggadah ourselves by using PowerPoint or other things, that we're constantly adapting and doing it, but the story is the same. The message is the same. It just gets adapted to what we need at our time and place. Yeah, Deborah.
I think there's also another aspect to like having a universal story that covers all of us, but it's not necessarily true, because if they, for instance, were going to talk about that story being the destruction of the temple, it's too close, it's too hurtful, it's too horrible. It's how I imagine this Pesach is going to be as soon as somebody mentions Gaza. So if we've agreed on sort of a creation story that in some way is kind of one generation removed, it's not quite as hurtful, but it kind of gives us a safe place to talk about those ideas like justice and deliverance and how do we treat other people without like getting into such a fight we kill each other at the Seder.
Yeah, or allowing it and saying, you know what, it's okay for us to get into discussion, right? To offer, like, not to kill each other over it, right? And to be respectful to it, but to say, like, this is actually our tradition, is to say we need to, like, it's okay to disagree. It's okay to be in conversation. It's okay to ask hard questions. It's okay to sit and to wrestle. Like, that's very much who we are. And actually, that's what gets recorded in Haggadah, that we end up just reading instead of actually participating in it.
And there's no answer.
There's no answers. There's no answers in the Haggadah. It's like, there's no written, I mean, there are in some of the Haggadahs, there are written answers, but there's not supposed to be. There's just supposed to be the questions to get us to ask. And the questions are only given because sometimes we don't know the questions to ask. But the idea is to be able to expand upon it, to ask the questions and to come up with our own answers. Marty, do I see your hand? Oh, you're muted.
I've been called away. I have to go. Thank you very
Right.
much. I
Thank you, Gail.
appreciate your having done this.
Yeah. Marty, we still can't hear you. There you
Hi.
go.
Now, from what I've been seeing on the outline, the direction is to have the meal on the first night?
Yes.
And then is there a pecking order? So I know a lot of people do first and second night. Is doing it on the last night, what does that do? Or how does that work?
You could do it any night. The tradition is that you only did it on one night. The reason why we got to the second night is the same reason why we have like 2 days of Rosh Hashanah in some traditions or whatever, because you're not in Jerusalem, you're not sure exactly when it's happening, so you want to make sure that you do it. So anything that's not the first night, you can definitely do. And I would say, here's the thing that I would say, is that part of the first meal was the fact that people needed to come together as a community, right? To get together, and that you weren't supposed to just do this on your own. You were coming together for a meal. So sometimes in our modern day world where we don't actually live near our relatives, or we live lives that are much harder, that sometimes we need to do that over a weekend in order to be able to come together. So to me, the most important thing is to go and tell the story and to come together with a community and to have the food out there and to eat the food during the week, because it gets us to remember the story of the Exodus. And that if you can't do it on the first night and you do it on a different night, you're still fulfilling that obligation. And that if that feels right to you, then that is a perfectly fine thing to do. Traditionally, you do it on the first night, but I think it's about evolving and celebrating and telling the story.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, I wish you all a Hag Sameach coming up, and to celebrate it in a meaningful way this year with lots of conversation, with really good food, ask lots of questions, maybe find answers, maybe not, but at least be part of this, telling the story from generation to generation, because that is what we're truly obligated to do. And I think, especially in these times, to keep our traditions alive and to feel connected to those traditions and allow them to help us find strength and purpose and meaning in lives. Yeah, Katie.
Just wanted to say the Jew Belong folks have put together what looks like a really nice Haggadah from my scan of it that addresses current events in a nice way, and also very nicely welcomes people who are either not Jewish or don't speak Hebrew or whatever. So,
oh, wonderful.
Free.
That's great. Yeah, there's so many resources online. You can go to Haggadah.com. There's a lot of Haggadahs that way that have been created that people can download, and you can create your own as well. All right. Well, and if there's anything else, please let me know. Reach out. I wish you all a Hag Sameach coming up. It's good to see you all and to learn with you today.